The wind off the Han River did not just blow. It cut. It pulled at the air, whistling through the steel girders of the bridge, and forcing the city lights to blur into jagged streaks of neon. Amina stood at the railing, her hands gripped so tightly against the frozen metal that her knuckles turned pale. Below, the water was a black, churning void, indifferent to the life unfolding above it. She shifted her weight, feeling the vibration of a passing train rattle through the soles of her boots. The cold was absolute. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Against the vast, dark expanse of the Seoul skyline, every breath she took turned into a sharp plume of mist that vanished instantly into the night. She looked down at the dark surface of the river, watching the way the current pulled at the debris near the pylons. There was no hesitation in her posture, only the rhythmic, heavy thrum of the city moving on without her. She leaned forward, the railing pressing hard against her chest, and felt the finality. She opened her palm. Resting against the center of her skin was the silver key, its surface dull and cold. It was a small, unassuming piece of metal, yet it held the weight of 7 years. She traced the jagged edge with her thumb, feeling the familiar notches that had unlocked 1,000 doors. This key had been her passport to a life that was never truly hers. It opened a space where she had lived in the periphery, a place where she had learned to move softly, to avoid disturbing the silence. She stared at it, watching the way the bridge lights caught the silver, turning it into a brief, sharp spark in the darkness. Every scratch on the metal surface was a memory of a Tuesday night spent waiting. The key felt heavy, as if it were pulling her hand down toward the black water below. She squeezed her fingers shut, trapping the metal against her palm. It was the final physical link. She held it out over the railing, watching the wind catch the edge of her sleeve, and waited. She loosened her thumb. The silver key slipped from her grasp, catching the dim light of the bridge one last time as it tumbled into the void. It did not spin. It fell straight, a tiny metallic streak against the vast, dark backdrop of the Han. She leaned over the railing, her eyes tracking the descent until the metal vanished into the black, churning surface. There was no splash, no ripple that could be seen from this height. It simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the river as if it had never been. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against her ears. She kept her hand extended, fingers splayed, feeling the sudden absence of the weight. The air felt different now, lighter, though the cold remained. She watched the spot where the key had disappeared, waiting for a sign, a sound, or a shift in the current. Nothing came. The river continued its relentless flow toward the sea, indifferent to the small piece of her life now resting on its bed. She pulled her hand back, curling it into a fist, and turned away from the railing. The link was severed. The apartment was no longer a destination. She stood motionless on the bridge, the wind pulling at her hair. The cold air bit into her skin, but she did not pull her collar tighter. Instead, she stared out into the dark expanse of the city, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The reflection of the bridge lights shimmered in her eyes, casting long, fractured lines of blue across her features. Her face was a map of the last 7 years. The set of her jaw, the slight tension at the corners of her mouth, the stillness of her brow. She was not crying. The tears had been spent long ago, replaced by a hollow, steady resolve. She reached up to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead, her movements slow and deliberate. Every muscle in her face seemed to settle into a new, unfamiliar configuration, one stripped of the constant, quiet expectation. She stood alone, breathing the sharp, freezing air, finally present in her own life, watching the city lights blur into a soft, distant hum. The memory surfaced, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. The stale, recycled air of the arrival terminal 7 years ago. Amina stepped through the sliding glass doors and into the chaotic rhythm of Seoul. She held a single suitcase, the plastic handle digging into her palm. Its weight, the only constant in a world that felt suddenly impossibly large. Around her, the terminal was a blur of motion. People moved with a purpose she did not yet share, their voices rising in a language she could not parse. She stopped in the center of the concourse, the crowd parting around her like water around a stone. The sheer scale of the city loomed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sprawling grid of lights that promised everything and offered nothing. She checked the tag on her bag, then looked at the map on the wall, her fingers tracing the lines of a transit system that looked like a tangled web. She was 21, standing in the heart of a foreign country, with nothing but the contents of her bag and a quiet, burning hope. The air smelled of ozone. She took a breath and stepped forward into the noise. The subway station was a cavern of echoing footsteps and sharp, metallic announcements. Amina stood before the illuminated transit map, her head tilted, eyes darting across the complex web of colored lines. She tapped the glass screen with a trembling finger, trying to align the station names with the paper slip in her hand, but the characters blurred into an impenetrable wall of logic. She felt the press of the crowd at her back, a tide of commuters moving with a rhythm she could not catch. She took a half step back, her breath hitching as the realization of her own displacement settled in her chest. Just as she turned to leave, a hand reached past her shoulder. A finger, steady and precise, tapped a specific junction on the map. She looked up. A man stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the screen. He did not look at her initially, only at the map, his presence cutting through the noise of the station. He traced a path from her current location to her destination. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers with a quiet, intense focus. In that moment, the map stopped being a puzzle and became a promise. She nodded. The subway station was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Min-jun became the lens through which Amina viewed the city. He walked with a steady, measured pace that forced her to slow down, to observe the way the light hit the glass towers. He showed her the quiet corners of the district, the small shops tucked away, and the best places to watch the river at dusk. When the city felt too loud or too fast, he was the constant. He taught her the unspoken rules of the transit lines. She stopped checking her map. She stopped looking for the exit signs. Instead, she watched his hands, his posture. He provided a perimeter of safety that allowed her to breathe. She no longer felt like a ghost. She felt tethered. Every street corner and every park bench became a shared coordinate. She anchored her days to his schedule. The city was no longer an adversary, but a space they occupied together. And for now, that was enough to keep the cold at bay. The city outside continued to pulse, but Amina found herself spending more time within the four walls of his apartment. The rhythm of her days shifted from exploring the bustling streets to waiting for the lock to turn. She learned the specific sound of his footsteps in the hallway, and the exact minute he would set his briefcase on the table. The apartment became a sanctuary, then a cage. She spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with ingredients to recreate the flavors he preferred, her movements measured and silent. She kept the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun, preferring the soft, muted light that filled the rooms. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the living room and the narrow kitchen counter. She stopped seeking out new districts or meeting new people, finding it easier to remain in the quiet, controlled environment he provided. When he was away, she occupied the space with a deliberate stillness, careful not to displace a single item or alter the order he maintained. She became a fixture of the interior, a presence that existed only when the door was shut. The walls of the apartment eventually gave way to the curated atmosphere of dinner parties. Min-jun would lead her into rooms filled with polished surfaces and low, rhythmic conversation. She would stand at his side, her hand hovering near his arm, waiting for the moment of introduction. When the inevitable question came from a guest, he would turn, offer a practiced smile, and gesture toward her. "This is my colleague," he would say, his voice smooth and devoid of hesitation. The word hung in the air, cold and definitive. It stripped away the 7 years of shared mornings and quiet nights, reducing her to a professional footnote. She felt the weight of the lie press against her chest. She tried once to correct him, to offer a different truth, but he tightened his grip on her elbow, a sharp, warning pressure that forced her to remain silent. She stood there, trapped in the glare of the dining room lights, watching him navigate the room with ease while she became a ghost in the crowd. She turned to the kitchen as a final battleground for belonging. She spent weeks studying the precise fermentation of cabbage, the exact ratio of chili paste, and the specific temperature required for the perfect kimchi. She sourced ingredients from distant markets, hauling heavy bags across the city to ensure the quality met the standards his mother demanded. She practiced until her hands were stained with spice and her skin smelled of garlic and ginger. When she finally served the dish, she watched him closely, waiting for a sign of recognition or a mention of the effort she had poured into the ceramic bowl. He ate in silence, his focus entirely on his phone. He did not ask how she made it or whose recipe she had mirrored. She was the one who prepared the meal, but she was never the one invited to the table when his family gathered. She remained a phantom in his household, a provider of comfort who was never allowed to step into the light of his lineage. She would arrange the side dishes with surgical precision, creating a perfect spread. Yet his mother remained a stranger, a name mentioned in passing but never encountered. Each meal she prepared was a testament to her devotion, yet it only served to highlight the distance between them. She was mastering a culture that refused to acknowledge her existence, pouring her energy into a role that provided sustenance, but never status. She began to measure time not in months, but in the slow accumulation of missed opportunities. Every morning, she watched him prepare for the day, his movements precise and deliberate. She would stand in the doorway, waiting for him to look at her not as a secret, but as a partner. She imagined a future where they walked through the city streets under the sun, where he would reach for her hand in front of his colleagues, or introduce her to his world without a script. She held on to this hope like a fragile anchor, believing that if she just waited long enough, the daylight would finally reach her. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years. She watched him leave the apartment every morning, his back turned to her, his focus locked on the life he kept separate from her existence. The fatigue began to settle into her bones. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding erosion of her spirit. She stopped asking about his plans. She stopped waiting for the phone to ring with an invitation. The constant need to remain hidden began to feel like a physical weight, pulling her shoulders down and dulling the sharpness of her resolve. She realized that the daylight she craved was never going to be offered by him. The silence in their apartment stopped being a lack of noise and became a presence of its own. It filled the corners of the rooms, settled into the floorboards, and hung in the air between them like a thick, unbreathable fog. Amina would stand by the kitchen counter, listening to the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, waiting for the sound of a voice to shatter the stillness. It never came. She tried to force a crack in the wall, asking about his day or the weather, but her words fell into the void without an echo. He would offer a brief nod or a single-word response, his eyes never leaving the glow of his screen. The air grew heavy. Every movement she made, the clinking of a glass, the rustle of a page, felt like a transgression against the quiet he demanded. She stopped trying to fill the space with music or conversation. Instead, she learned to move like a shadow, careful not to disturb the stillness. The apartment was no longer a place of shared life, but a tomb of unspoken tensions. The walls feel like they were slowly closing in on her. Dinner became a ritual of performance. Amina set the table with 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, and 2 glasses, placing them with a calculated precision that mirrored the order he demanded. She sat across from him, the small wooden table acting as a vast, unbridgeable divide. The light from the overhead lamp cast long, sharp shadows across his face, obscuring his expression. She watched him eat, his movements measured and efficient, never once looking up to meet her gaze. The clinking of his fork against the ceramic plate sounded like a gavel in the quiet room. She reached for her water, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, yet he did not acknowledge the movement. They were close enough to touch, yet the distance between them felt like miles of empty space. She tried to focus on the steam rising from her bowl, but her attention kept drifting back to the man sitting just inches away. He was present, yet entirely unreachable. Every bite felt like a chore, a mechanical necessity performed in the shadow of his indifference. She looked at his hands, steady and composed, and felt the weight of her own invisibility. The meal continued in a rhythmic, agonizing cycle. She had never felt further away. The meal ended without a word. The plates cleared away in a mechanical, hollow sequence. Min-jun moved to the living area, his posture rigid as he settled into the armchair. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen illuminating his face with a cold, flickering light. Amina followed, stopping just a few feet behind him. She waited for him to look up, to acknowledge the space she occupied, but his thumb moved rhythmically across the glass. He scrolled through messages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Completely untethered from the room, she stood there for a long moment, watching the reflection of the screen in the darkened window. He was physically present, yet his mind was miles away. She took a step closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight. But he did not flinch. He did not turn. He did not pause. The blue light reflected in his eyes, masking any warmth he might have once held for her. She was a ghost in her own home. Amina turned back to the kitchen to clear the remnants of the evening. The counter was cluttered with mail he had tossed aside earlier. She reached for a stack of envelopes, her movements sluggish and tired. Beneath a pile of bills, a heavy, textured card caught her eye. It was cream-colored, thick, and embossed with gold lettering that caught the harsh overhead light. She pulled it from the stack, her thumb tracing the raised edges of the paper. She opened the flap. Her eyes scanned the text, skipping over the formal language until the names anchored her focus. They were not their names. She read them again, the ink blurring slightly as her grip tightened. The invitation was for a wedding, dated for the following month. The location was a hotel in the city center. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her fingers cold against the heavy cardstock. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing inward with the weight of the discovery. She looked at the counter, then at the living room where he sat, his back still turned to her. The paper trembled in her hand, a sharp, crisp sound in the silence. Everything she had built in this apartment, every compromise she had made, shattered in the space of a single heartbeat. She stood motionless, the invitation held out like a mirror. Amina walked into the living room, the invitation still gripped in her palm. She stopped at the edge of the desk. Min-jun was hunched over his laptop, the rapid clacking of keys filling the room like gunfire. She waited for a pause, a breath, a moment of transition, but he did not stop. She reached out and placed the cream-colored card directly onto the glowing surface of his desk, right in his line of sight. The gold lettering caught the light. He didn't look up. His fingers continued to dance across the keys, his focus locked entirely on the screen. She cleared her throat, the sound thin and fragile in the heavy air. She asked him about the names, about the date, about the life he was planning that did not include her. He didn't even blink. He didn't shift his weight. He simply reached out with his left hand, shoved the invitation aside to make room for his mouse, and kept typing. The indifference was more violent than a shout. He treated her presence as a minor interruption. She stood there, watching the back of his head. Amina leaned forward, her hands bracing against the edge of the desk. She refused to move until he acknowledged the paper. Finally, the rhythmic tapping of the keys ceased. The sudden absence of sound made the air feel thin. Min-jun exhaled, a long, sharp breath that signaled his annoyance. He pushed his chair back just enough to create a physical barrier. He did not turn his head to meet her eyes. Instead, he stared at the wall, his jaw tight, his shoulders locked in a rigid line. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of warmth. He told her that he was busy and that she was overreacting to a simple piece of mail. She pressed him again, her voice shaking but insistent. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision. He uttered the words with a practiced, hollow ease. "It is complicated, Amina. Just wait a little longer." He turned back to the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys, ready to resume. He had dismissed her pain with a single, empty phrase. The room settled back into the rhythmic clatter of his work. Amina stood still, her pulse thrumming in her throat, waiting for a spark of regret that never came. She turned away from the desk, needing to escape the suffocating weight of his indifference. She walked toward the window, her footsteps muffled by the floorboards. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of neon, casting long, fractured shadows across the glass. She stopped. The window acted as a dark, unforgiving mirror. She looked at the woman staring back at her, but the features felt foreign. She saw the set of a jaw she did not recognize, eyes that had grown dull from years of waiting for a permission that never arrived. Every gesture she had made for 7 years, every meal cooked, every word softened, every ambition shelved had been to fit into a space he had never truly opened for her. She realized then that she had not just lost him. She had lost the ability to name her own desires. The silence in the room was no longer just about his neglect. Amina pulled her hand away from the glass. The coldness of the surface no longer bothered her. It was a clarity she had lacked for years. She turned back to the room. Min-jun was still at the desk, his breathing steady and rhythmic, completely unaware of the shift that had just occurred. She moved toward the bedroom, placing each foot carefully to avoid the loose floorboards that had plagued her for years. Every creak was a risk, but she navigated the shadows with a precision born of long familiarity. She reached the bedroom door and pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The air here was heavy with the scent of his routine, but it no longer felt like home. She knelt by the storage space beneath the bed and pulled out her suitcase. The metal latches clicked, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. She opened the lid and began the work of dismantling 7 years of life. She did not rush. She did not look back at the sleeping figure in the other room. The resolve in her chest was a steady, burning heat that kept her hands from shaking. She was no longer waiting for permission. She was simply leaving. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting long silver bars across the floor. Amina worked in the pale glow, her movements fluid and practiced. She picked up a stack of books from the shelf, felt their weight, and set them back down. They were his choices, not hers. She left them behind. She moved to the closet, pulling out items she had kept only to please him. Each piece of fabric she set aside felt like a layer of skin she was finally shedding. She folded a sweater, then stopped, her fingers lingering on the weave. She had worn it to dinners where she barely spoke, afraid to break the fragile piece he demanded. She dropped it into the trash bin instead of the suitcase. The sound of the fabric hitting the bottom was final. She grabbed her remaining essentials, the few things that truly belonged to her, and tucked them into the bag. She knelt on the floor, pressing her weight against the lid until the latches snapped shut. The room felt lighter now, stripped of the clutter that had defined her existence for so long. She stood up, her breath hitching once before evening out. The suitcase was heavy, but the burden she had carried for 7 years was gone. She looked at the sleeping figure one last time, not with anger, but with the cold, clear detachment of a stranger. The exit was ready. Amina gripped the handle of her suitcase, the leather biting into her palm. She turned toward the door, her movements deliberate and silent. She paused at the threshold. The apartment behind her, a tomb of stale air and unkept promises. The silence was absolute, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic breathing from the bedroom. She did not look back. She reached out, her fingers finding the lock, and turned the mechanism with a sharp, metallic click. The sound echoed in the hallway, but she did not flinch. She pushed the door open, the cool air of the corridor rushing in to meet her. It carried the scent of rain and distant traffic, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness she was leaving behind. She stepped out, the floorboards beneath her feet feeling solid for the first time in years. She pulled the door shut, the latch engaging with a definitive thud that signaled the end of her 7-year confinement. She walked toward the stairwell, her pace quickening with every step. She did not glance at the door again. She descended the stairs, her shadow stretching long against the concrete walls. The train rattled away from the city. the concrete skyline dissolving into a blur of gray and green. Amina pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the familiar world shrink until it was nothing more than a memory. Each mile gained was a layer of the past stripped away. The air inside the carriage grew thin, replaced by the scent of ozone and damp earth. As the train cut through the hills, the landscape opened up, revealing a jagged, wind-swept coastline. The ocean appeared, a vast expanse of slate-gray water churning against black rocks. She stepped off the platform at the final stop, the sudden silence of the town hitting her harder than the city noise ever had. The wind here was different. It carried the sharp, biting tang of salt. She stood on the station platform, the suitcase at her feet, and watched the train pull away, taking the last echoes of her old life with it. She turned away from the tracks, her boots crunching on the gravel, and walked toward the sound of the crashing waves. The shop was a hollow shell of dust and shadows when she first turned the key. Amina did not hesitate. She cleared the counters, scrubbed the floor until her knuckles were raw, and hauled heavy sacks of flour into the back room. The work was brutal, a physical assault on her own exhaustion. She measured, poured, and mixed, her movements sharp and unpracticed. The first batch of dough was a disaster, a sticky, unyielding mess that clung to her fingers like the memories she tried to shed. She slammed the mass onto the wooden table, the sound echoing through the empty shop. She pressed her palms into the center, driving her weight down, forcing the resistance out of the mixture. She pushed, folded, and turned, her muscles burning with every repetition. She did not stop when her shoulders ached or when the sweat stung her eyes. She kneaded the weight of 7 years of silence into the dough. The rhythm took over. Push, fold, press. The dough grew smooth and elastic. She worked until the sun began to bleed through the window. The bakery became a sanctuary of heat and flour. Each morning, the oven hummed with a steady, low vibration that mirrored the rhythm of the rising tide outside. Amina spent her hours in this loop, the heat of the hearth pressing against her skin, the salt air cooling her face. For years, she had spoken only when spoken to, her words measured and swallowed. Here, the silence was different. It was not a cage, but a canvas. She began to hum, a low sound that grew into words. She spoke to the dough, to the cooling racks, to the empty air. The sound of her own voice startled her at first, raspy from disuse, but she persisted. She narrated her movements, the temperature of the room, the shifting colors of the dawn. When the tide pulled back, leaving the shore exposed, she stood at the threshold of her shop and shouted into the wind. The ocean roared back, a chaotic, powerful response that drowned out the last whispers of her old life. She found that her voice was not a fragile thing to be hidden, but a tool to command her space. She spoke her own name aloud, testing the weight of it. The morning light hit the storefront, turning the dust motes into dancing gold. Amina wiped the counter, her movements fluid and efficient. The bell chimed, signaling the first arrival of the day. A regular customer stepped inside, shaking off the damp coastal air. Amina looked up, her expression open and bright. She did not retreat or look away. She greeted the visitor with a steady, clear tone. The shop was no longer a place of hiding. It was a place of exchange. She moved behind the display, sliding a tray of golden, crusty bread toward the glass. The customer laughed at a comment she made, and Amina joined in, the sound genuine and unforced. She felt the warmth of the oven behind her and the cool, fresh air from the open door meeting in the center of the room. She handled the transaction with precision, her hands steady as she wrapped the bread in brown paper. When the customer left, she did not rush to close the door. She stood for a moment, watching the street. She was visible. She was the one in control. The shop settled into a midday lull. The rush had passed, leaving behind the lingering scent of yeast and toasted grain. Amina moved to the back, clearing the flour from the wooden prep table with a rhythmic swipe of her hand. She hummed a melody, her mind tracing the patterns of the afternoon tasks. The sunlight shifted across the floorboards, marking the slow passage of time. She reached for a heavy sack of flour, her muscles working with practiced ease. Everything was predictable. Everything was hers. She turned toward the front display to check the remaining stock, her posture relaxed. Then, the silence of the room snapped. The brass bell above the door gave a sharp, metallic jangle. It was not the casual chime of a local regular. Amina froze. Her hand hovered over the display case. She did not turn immediately. She took a breath, held it, and finally turned her head toward the entrance. The past had crossed the threshold. Amina turned, her movements deliberate. The man standing in the doorway was a ghost of the life she had left behind. Min-jun stood there, his frame slightly hunched against the frame of the shop door. The sharp, precise lines she remembered were gone. His posture lacked its former rigidity, and his shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight he could no longer balance. He did not step forward. He remained on the threshold, his eyes scanning the room with a frantic, searching quality. He looked as though he had traveled a great distance. His breathing was shallow, audible over the low hum of the oven. He gripped the edge of the doorframe, his knuckles white against the wood. He seemed to be waiting for a signal, a word, or a gesture that would bridge the 3 years of silence between them. The air around him felt heavy, dragging the brightness of the shop down into the shadows. He did not speak. He simply stood there. He looked at Amina, his gaze lingering on her face. The distance between them was only a few paces, but it felt like an ocean. Min-jun shifted his weight, his eyes darting across the room before locking onto hers. He was searching for the woman who had once waited for his approval, the one who had lived in the quiet corners of his life. He held her gaze, trying to pull a flicker of recognition from the depths of her expression. He looked for the hesitation, the softness, the unspoken questions that used to define their interactions. But he found nothing. Amina stood behind the counter, her hands resting firmly on the wood. She did not lean in. She did not pull away. She simply observed him with a steady, clinical detachment. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant sound of the morning tide. Min-jun blinked, his brow furrowing as he processed the lack of reaction. He tried to speak, his lips parting, but no sound emerged. He was looking for a ghost, but the person standing before him was entirely present, entirely solid, and entirely unreachable. He scanned her face again, searching for a crack in her composure, a sign that the old dynamic still held sway. There was no trace of the past in her eyes. Min-jun finally moved. He crossed the short distance between the threshold and the counter with a heavy, uneven gait. His hand went into his pocket, fingers fumbling for a moment, before he pulled out a small, velvet-covered square. He set it down on the worn wood of the counter. The box made a soft, dull thud that echoed in the quiet shop. It sat there, centered between them, a stark contrast to the flour-dusted surface. Amina looked down at the object. It was the same shape, the same size, the same promise she had spent 7 years waiting for him to offer. She remembered the nights she had imagined this exact moment, the way she had rehearsed her reaction, the way she had hoped to feel. Now, the box was just a container. It held no power over the space she had built for herself. She did not reach for it. Min-jun kept his hand on the box for a second, his knuckles pressing into the velvet, before he pulled his fingers back. Min-jun cleared his throat, the sound jagged and dry. He leaned forward, his palms pressing into the counter edge, mirroring her posture but lacking her stillness. He began to speak, his voice low and strained, barely rising above the hum of the cooling units. He spoke of the years he spent building a life that felt hollow, of the choices he made to prioritize status over the person who had actually anchored him. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses for the silence he had kept. Instead, he laid his failures out, one by one, as if naming them could somehow reverse the damage. He admitted that in his pursuit of everything else, he had systematically dismantled the only foundation that mattered. He looked at his own hands, then back at the box, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He confessed that he had lost everything: the career, the expectations, the life he thought he wanted, only to realize that the cost was his own humanity. His words tumbled out, stripped of his usual polish, revealing a man who had finally run out of defenses. He stopped, his breath hitching, waiting for a response that did not come. The confession hung in the air, heavy and useless, a testament to a realization that had arrived 3 years too late. Amina did not blink. She let the silence stretch, watching the way his chest rose and fell with each ragged breath. The air in the bakery felt thin, charged with the static of a life she had long ago packed away. She looked down at the velvet box, then slowly shifted her eyes to the shop door. The glass was clear, showing the street outside, the world she had built without him. She looked back at Min-jun. His eyes were wide, searching, desperate for a flicker of the woman who had once waited for his signal. She gave him nothing. She held her head high, her jaw set, her shoulders relaxed but firm. Every second that passed without her speaking tightened the knot in his throat. She watched the way his hands twitched on the counter, the way he shifted his weight, his entire posture collapsing under the weight of her indifference. The shop bell remained silent. She stood like a statue, her gaze locked onto his, waiting for him to realize that the conversation was already over. Min-jun saw the lack of movement, and his fingers twitched. He nudged the velvet box a fraction of an inch closer to her, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the counter. He expected a flinch, a hesitation, or perhaps a sharp intake of breath. He got none of those. Amina did not even glance at the movement. She remained anchored to the spot, her hands resting flat on the flour-dusted surface, fingers splayed with calm, deliberate pressure. The box sat there, a small, expensive island of gold and velvet, utterly ignored. Min-jun's gaze darted from the box to her face, searching for a crack in her composure, a sign that the weight of the past still held sway. He saw only a quiet, impenetrable strength. The silence between them grew heavy, thick enough to stifle the sound of the street outside. He opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to demand an answer, but the words died in his throat before they could form. Her refusal was not a shout or a gesture. It was a total withdrawal of her attention. She had effectively erased his presence from the room. Amina shifted her weight, the floorboards creaking under her feet. She reached out, her fingers closing firmly around the wooden handles of a tray piled high with golden, crusty loaves. The heat from the bread radiated against her palms, a sharp, grounding sensation that pulled her fully into the present. She did not look at Min-jun again. She simply stepped forward. He was standing in her path, but she moved with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who owned the space she occupied. She brushed past his shoulder, the scent of flour and yeast trailing behind her like a shield. He stumbled back a step, forced to yield the ground he had been occupying. A customer stood at the end of the counter, waiting. Amina walked straight to them, her movements fluid and purposeful. She set the tray down with a soft thud and began to bag a loaf, her focus entirely on the transaction. She was working, she was serving, and she was thriving. Behind her, the space where Min-jun stood felt hollow, a ghost of a life she had long since discarded. She did not look back to see if he was still there. She did not need to. She had already moved on, and for the first time in 7 years, the only person she was waiting for was herself. The customer paid, the coins clinking against the wooden counter, and left with a nod. Amina turned back to the shop, her movements calm and rhythmic. Min-jun remained near the entrance, his posture slumped, the weight of his arrival finally settling into the reality of his departure. He looked at her, his lips parting as if to speak, but she did not give him the space to fill the air. She walked toward the door, her stride measured and firm. She reached for the handle, the brass cool under her grip. She pushed the door open, the bell above chiming a sharp, final note. Min-jun hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his movements slow and defeated. Amina did not wait for him to turn around. She pulled the door shut, the latch clicking. She turned back to her kitchen, entirely on her own terms. The shop was quiet now, save for the low, steady hum of the cooling racks. Amina walked to the window and watched the morning sun spill across the floorboards. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the space she had built with her own hands. She touched the wooden counter, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips, a reminder of the thousands of hours of labor that had forged her new reality. She was no longer waiting for a signal, a word, or a choice from someone else. The silence of the room was no longer a weight, it was a sanctuary. She walked to the back, tied her apron tighter, and began the process of kneading the next batch of dough. The physical resistance of the flour and water was familiar, a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. Outside, the town was waking up, the sound of the tides drifting in through the open vent. She breathed in the scent of yeast and salt air, a sharp, clean contrast to the stagnant air of her past. She had traded the uncertainty of his world for the absolute clarity of her own. She was whole. She was present. The work was done. Amina wiped the flour from her palms, the fine white dust falling away like sand. She stepped out of the bakery and into the cool, salt-heavy breeze of the afternoon. The shop door clicked shut behind her, but this time, she did not look back. She walked down the narrow path that led to the shoreline, her boots crunching against the gravel. The tide was coming in, the water rhythmically striking the rocks with a low, resonant thrum. She reached the edge of the sand and stopped, watching the horizon where the blue of the sea met the pale sky. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with the scent of brine and damp earth. She turned away from the water and began to walk along the coast, her pace steady and purposeful. The shoreline stretched out, a clean line between the earth and the endless expanse of the sea. Amina knelt, her fingers brushing the wet sand, and picked up a smooth, white shell. She turned it over, feeling the ridges worn down by the constant motion of the waves. It was a small, fragile thing, yet it had survived the turbulence of the deep water to reach the calm of the shore. She held it for a moment, then placed it back onto the sand, letting the next wave wash over it. The gesture was simple, a quiet acknowledgement that she too had survived the currents that once threatened to pull her under. She stood up, brushing the grit from her palms, and looked toward the distant lights of the town where her shop waited. The sun was dipping lower, casting long golden shadows across the path. She did not hurry. She walked with the measured pace of someone who no longer had anything to prove. The wind pulled at her hair, but she did not pull it back or hide. She simply walked, her shadow lengthening before her, leading the way home. The evening air cooled rapidly as she reached the edge of the town. Street lamps flickered to life, casting pools of amber light across the cobblestones. Amina walked past the rows of quiet houses, her footsteps echoing against the stone. She reached the door of her home, the wood cool and solid under her touch. She paused, hand resting on the latch, and looked back one final time at the path she had traveled. The horizon was dark, the sea a distant murmur, but here, the space was entirely her own. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of yeast and dried herbs greeting her. She locked the door, the metal bolt sliding into place with a definitive, heavy click. She moved to the window, watching the last of the twilight fade into a deep, velvet blue. There was no phantom presence, no lingering shadow of the man who once held her life in his hands. She was the architect of this silence, the keeper of this peace. She turned away from the glass, walked into the center of the room, and began to ready the space for the morning. The cycle of waiting had been replaced by the rhythm of living. She was home. The house settled around her, the timber groaning softly as the temperature dropped. Amina moved through the kitchen, clearing the last of the flour from the wooden counter with a damp cloth. Every motion was deliberate, a testament to the life she had built. She checked the locks one last time, the metal latch clicking with a finality that resonated in the quiet room. She walked to the center of the living space, where a single lamp cast a warm glow over her books and small personal items. She stood there for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing. There was no residue of the past, No lingering ache of the 7 years spent in the shadows of someone else's life. She reached out, her fingers finding the switch, and turned it. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint moonlight spilling across the floorboards. She walked toward the bedroom, her footsteps light and unburdened. The story of the girl who lived in the dim light was gone, replaced by the reality of a woman who owned her own dawn. The silence of the house was not empty. It was full of her own choices. Amina sat by the window as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. She watched the horizon, the line where the sea met the air, and felt the weight of the past dissolve into the morning mist. There were no more questions to ask. No more waiting for a signal that would never come. She stood up, her movements fluid and sure, and walked toward the kitchen. She began the work of the day, the familiar weight of the rolling pin in her hand, grounding her in the present. She was the one who decided when the oven was hot, when the bread was ready, and when the day would begin. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. She opened the shop door, the bell chiming a clear, bright note. She stepped onto the threshold and breathed in the scent of salt and fresh dough. She was ready. The morning rush began with the rhythmic clatter of the shop door and the low hum of conversation. Amina moved behind the counter, her hands working with a practiced, steady grace that required no thought. She handed a warm loaf to a regular, the crust crackling under her touch, and shared a brief, genuine smile. Outside, a man stopped on the sidewalk, his silhouette momentarily blocking the sun. For a heartbeat, the angle of his shoulders mirrored a memory she had long since filed away. She paused, the flour dusting her palms, and watched him through the glass. He checked his watch and walked on. The sight did not stir a tremor in her hands. It was merely a shape passing by, disconnected from her reality. She turned back to the oven, the heat radiating against her face, and pulled out a fresh tray. She was ready. The sun dipped below the coastal hills, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and burnt orange. Amina wiped the flour from the wooden counter, the surface smooth and cool under her palms. She moved to the front of the shop, turned the sign to closed, and bolted the door. The lock clicked into place with a sharp, definitive sound that echoed in the quiet room. She walked to the back, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet, and extinguished the lamps one by one. The darkness did not feel heavy or suffocating as it once had. It felt like a soft blanket, a space for rest. She stood in the center of the shop, listening to the distant rhythm of the tide. The past was a distant shore. She stepped out into the cool evening air. She was finally, completely, her own. The path to her cottage wound through the dunes, the grass whispering against her legs in the dark. Above, the stars were sharp points of light, unclouded and vast. She stopped for a moment, tilting her head back to trace the constellations, feeling the cool air settle deep in her lungs. There was no urgency in her stride, no phantom weight of expectation pulling at her shoulders. She reached her front door, the wood weathered by the salt spray, and pushed it open. Inside, the space was small, quiet, and entirely hers. She set her keys on the table, the metal clinking against the grain, and turned to look back at the horizon one last time. The ocean was a rhythmic, dark pulse in the distance, indifferent to the choices of the past. She closed the door, sliding the bolt home with a firm, deliberate motion. The sound was final. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain shut, and turned toward the center of the room. She had no more stories to tell about him, no more apologies to carry, and no more waiting to do. She was the architect of her own silence, the keeper of her own peace, and for the first time, she was exactly where she belonged. The room settled into the stillness of the late night. Amina sat by the small table, the lamp casting a warm, steady glow over her hands. She looked at them, the skin calloused, the knuckles steady, the fingers capable of shaping dough and building a life from scratch. These hands had once trembled in the shadow of someone else's expectations, but now they moved with a rhythm that belonged only to her. She poured a cup of tea, the steam rising in thin, graceful ribbons that vanished into the air. There was no lingering ache, no ghost of a conversation left unfinished. The silence was not empty. It was full of the work she had done and the person she had become. She blew out the lamp, the wick smoking briefly before the room plunged into a soft, velvet darkness. She lay down, the sheets cool and clean against her skin. Outside, the tide continued its slow, inevitable cycle, indifferent to the world she had left behind. She closed her eyes, her breathing deep and rhythmic. She had stopped waiting for a life to begin. She was living it. Every heartbeat was her own. Every breath was earned. And for the first time in her life, she was completely, undeniably whole. The first light of dawn bled across the horizon, turning the gray sea into a sheet of hammered silver. Amina stood at her window, watching the tide retreat, leaving behind a clean, wet shore. She moved through the cottage with a quiet, practiced grace, gathering her things for the day ahead. The air in the shop was already cool, smelling faintly of yeast and sea salt. She walked to the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open. The bell chimed, a bright, sharp sound that cut through the morning stillness. Outside, the town was waking up. A neighbor waved from across the street, and she returned the gesture, her expression steady and calm. She had built this space with her own labor and held it with her own strength. She turned back to the counter, picked up a dusting of flour, and began to work. The story of her life was no longer a question of waiting for someone else to arrive. It was a statement of her own presence. The sun climbed high, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards of the bakery. Amina moved between the cooling racks, her pace steady and unhurried. The day had been long, filled with the hum of voices and the clatter of plates, but now the shop was quiet again. She wiped the counter clean, the cloth moving in wide, deliberate circles until the wood shone. Outside, the evening wind picked up, carrying the scent of the incoming tide. She walked to the door and turned the lock, the metallic click echoing in the empty space. It was a sound of finality, not of loss. She looked out through the glass, seeing the reflection of the woman she had become. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no lingering doubt. She turned off the lights, leaving the shop to the soft glow of the moon. She stepped out into the night air. The sand crunched under her boots as she reached the waterline. The tide was pulling back, dragging pebbles and shells into the deep, rhythmic pulse of the ocean. Amina stood still, letting the cold spray mist against her skin. 7 years of waiting had dissolved into the salt air. She watched the horizon, where the dark water met the starless sky. There was no weight in her chest, only the steady beat of her own heart. She had learned that the most important choice she would ever make was the one to stay, to build, and to exist for herself. The past was a distant shore, unreachable and no longer calling. She turned away from the surf, her footsteps firm and deliberate as she walked back toward the lights of the town. The night was quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was full of the life she had claimed. She reached her home, closed the door, and stepped into the warmth of a space that belonged to no one but her. The journey was over. She was finally home. If you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.